again, everybody. It's good to see you guys. If you'll turn with me to Job chapter 1, that's where we're going to be spending our time this morning. Now, today we're just going to take a quick look at the book of Job. It's going to be a quick glance at Job. This is no way going to be an exhaustive study of the book. Most books you could spend your entire lifetime studying and still never come to an exhaustive understanding of it. Job is probably special in that it could probably take you several lifetimes to really dig in and understand exactly what's happening in this book of Job. What I want to encourage you to do this week, though, I know it's long. It's 42 chapters long. I get that. Job is a book of poetry that is written to be read and understood. Chapter 1 to chapter 42 is a single poem, is a single interaction with the Almighty God. I want to encourage you this week to find the time to sit down and read Job 1 through Job 42. Try to get it done this week. Job can be read a chapter a day or a chapter a week. It can be studied that way, absolutely. But to get a real understanding of what's happening, a flow of what's going on in the story of Job, it's good to at least one time in your life sit down and read Job 1 to Job 42 straight through. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it is possible. It can be done. When I was in college, in my inductive study Bible class in Romans, our first assignment was to sit down and read Romans as many times through as we could in one sitting. Just read it straight through over and over and over and over again. And at first that seems kind of crazy. It seems ridiculous. But you begin to see a flow and you begin to see the structure of the writing and how it works. And Job is the same way. Job is a unique book in the Old Testament. It's unique to really the entire Scripture. But Job is unique in that it is one of the books of poetry. Now, there aren't too many books of poetry in the Old Testament, right? But this is the first one that is written, okay? Find the time to read it, if you can, as a poem from beginning to end. Job, by anybody's measurement, is a masterpiece, whether you are a believer or not. It is a masterpiece of poetry, it is a masterpiece of writing. Now, one thing to understand about Hebrew poetry, as we get into it, is they don't write their poems with repeating sounds like we would, right? It's not like a song where we would repeat the sounds over and over again, and that's how we decipher whether or not it's a poem or just writing. In Hebrew poetry, they repeat ideas, they repeat thoughts, they repeat phrases. But this idea of a repetition of ideas is what Hebrew poetry is about. We see an example of this in the story of Jesus asking Peter if he loves him. Right? That's not poetry, but what he's doing is he's emphasizing this idea 3 times. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And we get that emphasis from how many times it's repeated as a way of emphasizing what really matters. So here's how the book begins. And we're only going to be looking at Job 1 this week and a little bit of Job 42 because I want to see how it ends. It's on you to read the rest of it this week at some point in your personal time and walk. But here's how the book begins. It begins in 2 parts. Chapter 1 takes place on 2 different stages. All right? Because the book of Job really is a drama. It is a dramatic story about what's happening. And the first stage, the first place this takes place on is earth. That's where we see Job 1:1 has us. This is what it says. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now, we don't know exactly who wrote the book of Job. It could have been Job. It could have been penned by his own hand later on in his life. It could have been written by Moses as part of the writings of the Pentateuch as he went back and wrote down what had happened in the history of the people. It could have been written by him. We don't exactly know who wrote it, but we know who it's about. We know that it's about a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. It is ancient, that much is beyond It's believed to be the very first story that we have written down outside of, obviously, the creation story. This is the first thing that the Bible teaches. It's the oldest book that we have. It's one of, if not the first recorded lesson that was ever written down by someone's hand, a lesson of God to man. That's how old it is. This is an ancient book. And it's an incredibly important message at that. It's the first one we get, so it's incredibly important. Now, we're going to read today, we're going to read about devastation in the life of Job. We're going to read about destruction. We're going to read about a loss of all things that he had, all the blessings of God. We're going to see them all taken away from him. But through all of that, this is the lesson. This is not a book primarily about one man's suffering and pain. It's not about Job's loss. It's not about what Job has had happen to him. The central problem, the central theme of the book of Job, this poem, is not financial or social or even medical. The central problem that God is dealing with here is theological. And what he's trying to teach Job and to teach us through Job is a theological lesson, and is this. Job must deal with the fact that God does not always act the way we wish he would or think he should. That's the message that Job learns. That's the message that we learn. God does not always act the way we wish he would or think he should. He doesn't. This is often a hard truth for us to swallow as human beings because we have in our mind a certain way that things are supposed to play out. That if I'm good, then I'm going to be blessed. And that if I'm bad, then I'm going to be punished. That's how things work on earth. But the truth is, God doesn't always work the way we think he will or wish that he would. Isaiah 55:8-9 emphasizes this for us. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. And a difficult truth for us to swallow sometimes is this. He does what he wants to do because he's God. He does what he does because he's God, and we may not ever understand it, especially not this side of heaven. But there are some things that we can take away from Job that can help us understand what this means. That can help us not swallow it because it can be a bitter pill to swallow, but can help us understand why it is that way and that we can trust God in that. Job goes on to describe his blessings. 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 oxen, 500 donkey, and so many servants. This man was the greatest of the people of the East. That's what it tells us. I don't know where East is. I don't know what part of the world that is, but it was the East, here somewhere. However far east that was, I'm not sure. But he was the greatest of the men of his time in the East. And though he is wealthy and powerful and considered to be the greatest, he is what we might consider today as being down to earth. He was not caught up in his blessings. He was not caught up in all that God had given him. He was down to earth. He did not think of himself as more than others. His children, though they were comfortable, were not spoiled. They held feasts on their appointed days and no other days. They weren't spoiled, but they were blessed. And then after these feasts, just to show us the kind of man Job was, this is what it says, Job 1:5. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, his children. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continue. That's who Job was. That's what he did. That's the type of parent he was, and that's the type of life that he lived. Maybe they cursed God in their hearts without even knowing it. Let me give an offering, a sacrifice for my kids so that they may be right with God. Now, much later in the book, we're going to catch a glimpse of what Job actually did with his money, what Job actually did with his power, his time, and his energy. Job was a man who rescued the needy. He cared personally for the handicapped and the orphans of his area. He brought them into his home and he took care of them. He poured out his money and his blessings on other people. He even took the power brokers, the barons, the people, the elite of the time. He took them to court to stand up for those who were less fortunate. That's the type of man that Job was. Job was a good man, but Job was not a sinless man. But through his faith, he was made blameless. That's why it tells us in Job 1:1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless, not sinless, but blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. His faith made him blameless. That means that he sinned, but God did not count it against him the way others had it counted against them, because he was blameless in the eyes of God. Now we see this description of Job echoed in the second stage of this story. And the second stage happens in heaven, in the heavenly realms. And it's in this place, in this stage, that we get a glimpse of the divine, a glimpse of what happens in heaven and in the spiritual realm around us. I want to read for us Job 1:6-12, so we can get a glimpse and understand of what's happening here, because this is presented not as a story. This is not presented as an ethereal thing that's happening. This is presented as a physical thing that is happening in heaven. That this is part of the story. This is what happened there. Verse 6, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Now I want us to take a quick moment, because when it comes to spiritual things, we don't have a great understanding of what that looks like in our life. We don't have a great understanding of what heaven actually looks like here, because it's beyond our comprehension. It's beyond our understanding. We don't have a great understanding of what the heavenly places are, the sons of God, the heavenly court. We don't have a good understanding of that. But this is what's happening basically. The heavenly host, the angels, the angelic beings are gathered before the Lord, and among them there's one who is given the title, the Satan. Now that's where we get the name Satan, but in this it's given the name the Satan, and the Satan means the accuser. This is what it says. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them, the Satan. Verse 7, the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, from walking up and down, and I've been going to and fro. I've been doing evil deeds. I've been doing hood rat stuff, because that's what I do, because I'm the Satan. That's what he does. That's what he's saying. That's who I am. I've been going to and fro, doing bad stuff. God, you know this. Now, this is an interesting picture because it tells us two things about Satan and about God. The first and the foremost, the most important, is this, that Satan is among the angels. That's the power level he finds himself at. He is among the angels. And because he's on this level, he is in no way the opposite or the counterpoint to God. Now, this is something that our culture would try to confuse us on. Satan is not the opposite of God. It's not like God is light and Satan is darkness and they are locked in an eternal battle. That's not the picture we're presented with. Satan is a created being. He's on level with the angels. That's the power he has. He is not the counterpoint to our God. He is not the counterpoint or the opposite or the match to the Son or the Holy Spirit. That's not who he is. He is a created being who is beneath them. Satan wishes he was on the level of God, but he never has been and he never will be. That's the first thing we see. The second thing is this. God still allows Satan and the fallen beings to have access to himself in the heavenly places. One day they will be barred to earth and then to hell, but for now they have access to the courts of God, but he only allows them access for one reason: to further his own purposes as God. That's the only reason they're allowed there. That's the only reason he has an audience with them. Verse 8 says this, the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? Now here God reinforces what we know about Job, that he's blameless and that he's upright, that he fears God, that he turns away from evil. And this strong statement about Job's godliness is important for us to understand what happens in this story. Because if we recognize the righteousness of Job, it saves us from making the mistake that at any point during this story, that what's happening is Job's fault. And we have to be very clear and very careful that we don't think that or believe that. Because there will be friends of Job who come and begin to accuse him, saying, you must have done something wrong, Job, for this to happen. This right here tells us that is not the case. Everything that happens from here on out has nothing to do with Job other than the fact that it's happening to Job. It is not his fault. He remains blameless and upright before the Lord. This explanation has nothing to do with the man himself. He suffers, but it's not a penalty for his own wrongdoings. It's not chastisement or correction from God. Job is who we think he is. Job is who Scripture tells us he is. There's no hidden issue here that he's dealing with. He is upright. And at this point, there's something we have to understand about Satan. We have to understand who Satan is. God asks him, have you considered? Have you considered Job? Of course, Satan has considered Job, and he despises Job. Of course, he considers the saints of God. Of course, in the course of his everyday walk and his everyday life, Satan considers you, the saints of God, and the saints of God all over the world, both then and now. But what does he see when he looks at us? What does Satan see when he looks at you, when he considers you? He sees you, and he's amazed at the difference between you and himself, between himself and God's people. He sees us and knows that though he has fallen, we have been raised up into new life, and he despises us for it. He sees us and is amazed at our happiness and our joy because he knows the misery that his own decision and soul has brought him. He admires and he hates the soul that you've been given. He despises the believer. He sees us and he looks for some fault in what we do, for some fault in how we walk, so that he may find some small comfort in his own disgustingness and hypocrisy. That's who Satan is. He sees you, he considers you, and he despises you. He sees us, especially the great hearts among the great saints, and he sees the evil deeds that you, through your prayer and through your work, block him from being able to do in the lives of others, and he hates you for it. He looks at you and he finds opportunities to do harm. That's who Satan is. Satan considers you and he despises you because you are a saint of God. Verse 9, then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. Now, Satan's reply to God reveals that essentially Satan is a cynic of the highest order. He is a cynic. He doubts every supposed good as being dishonest and hollow. He says, hey, God, he only acts that way because you've blessed him. If you took everything he had, he would curse you to your face. God, cynicism. And this is important. Cynicism is the essence of the satanic in our life and in the life of spiritual realms and spiritual beings. The Satan believes nothing to be genuinely good, neither Job and his disinterested piety, nor God and his disinterested generosity. To be a cynic is one thing. To be filled with cynicism is satanic. It removes you from the blessings of God. If you look around and you see people who are doing good and who are being blessed, and you think to yourself, they're only doing that to get further ahead in life. I read a story this week that there's a school in California that changed their name from Abraham Lincoln High School. It's an inner city school. It's a black school. They said Abraham Lincoln only did what he did for political purposes to further his own political agenda. And I thought that is absurd. That's an absurd statement. It's an absurd thing for us to teach the next generation, that people only do good to further their own life is a cynical thought. And when you get to that level of cynicism, you are on par with Satan himself. And we have to be very careful that we don't reach that point in our life, that we look around and see other people's blessings and the good that other people do and say, they're only doing that to get ahead. That's what Satan is saying here. Verse 12, and the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now when we read this, there may be a lot of different things that run through our head. A lot of different issues that are going on in our own mind as we try to parse through what God is doing here. Giving freedom to Satan to do whatever he wants to in the life of Job. It's like that movie, Trading Places. Have you ever seen that? With Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy, where the Duke brothers decide they're going to ruin one man's life and they're going to change another man's life for a simple bet over a dollar bill. And that's what they do. Have you seen the movie? It ends up bad for the Dukes thanks to the frozen concentrated orange juice market. But that's what this feels like in our own understanding of it, in our human understanding that God and Satan are simply making a bet over the life of Job, and we're going to see Job's life completely destroyed to prove a point. That's what it can feel like. Two great powers using an innocent bystander to prove their point. That's what this looks like on the surface, but there's a couple things that we need to remember and a couple things we need to understand. And the first is what I said before. God and Satan are not equals. They are not equals. This is not two great powers having a bet. This is one being coming to the creator of the universe and challenging him, and God saying, okay, let me show you how this works. Let me show you what's about to happen. Satan would have done everything that happens to Job. He would have done it long ago if God hadn't protected him. Because that's who Satan is. He would have done this long ago had God not been protecting them. And even though Satan now has the ability to attack Job, his ability is limited by the power of God. Satan can only do what God will allow him to do. Satan has no power on his own to go above and beyond God. And the second thing we have to know and understand is this: that God's end in this was not to gratify the devil, but to glorify himself. And that's what's going to happen in this story. That's what's going to happen through this book of Job, by making Satan an instrument of his own shame and his own infamy is what's going to happen. Before we finish chapter 1, I want to take us to the end of the book, because I want us to see where this story is going, because it makes it a little easier for us to understand. It softens the blow of what happens here in just a little bit. Turn to chapter 42, verses 10 through 13. This is what it says. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had had before. And the Lord blessed the days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 1,400 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Now, like we talked about last week with Joseph, what was meant for evil, the work of Satan, is actually going to be turned to good. God's going to use it for good. Satan was allowed to be the author of Job's trials, of Job's losses, but all his labor will be wasted. For in the end, Job received double the blessing from God. He received double of what God had given him previously. And as good as Job is at the beginning of this book, Job is going to be even better at the end. Those do not break Job, but they grow him. More than he was at the beginning. He's better than he was at the beginning. Better in character, humbler, and more blessed than ever. Spurgeon says this about it. I love the way Spurgeon puts stuff, because, well, that's just what he does. He says, foolish devil, he is piling up a pedestal on which God will set up his servant Job, that he may be looked upon with wonder by all ages. Oh, how many saints have been comforted in their distress by this history of patience. How many have been saved out of the jaw of the lion and from the paw of the bear by the dark experiences of the patriarch of Uz. O arch-fiend, how art thou taken in thine own net? Thou hast thrown a stone which has fallen on thine own head. Thou madest a pit for Job and hast fallen into it thyself. Thou art taken in thine own craftiness. My papa's favorite cartoon growing up was the Roadrunner. And what always happens to Wile E. Coyote whenever he sets a trap for the Roadrunner? He always falls into it, doesn't he? The stone ends up on his own head. He falls in the own pit. The Acme rocket always blows up the coyote, and the Roadrunner is always fine. That's what this reminds me of. No matter how much Satan does, no matter how much Satan attacks, no matter how much Satan pours on top of Job or his saints, it always comes back to lift us up, to make us a blessing. Satan was trying to dig a grave for Job, but what he was actually doing was piling on a pedestal that was going to lift Job up in the eyes of God. When Satan leaves the presence of God, in verse 12, he proceeds to, in one day, take all that Job has been blessed with. In one day, he takes the donkey and the ox and the camel and the sheep, the servants, the sons and daughters. He wipes it all away through destruction. He's given the freedom to, and therefore he maximizes the destruction as quickly as possible. He works through Job's rivals to come and destroy and to steal and to take all that he has. He works through the wind and through the weather to bring down tents and houses on the of his families. And the lives, and attacking Job, the lives of his servants and his children are taken. Now, to understand this in our minds, to justify it, if you will, if we can justify what God does in any way, that God would allow this to happen, these acts of violence and these tragedies. Why would God allow these to happen? We have to approach this tragedy with the same mindset that Job does. Something that we have to understand and we have to learn is that we have to keep our eye on eternity. We have to keep our eye on eternity, the rightness or the wrongness of what God either allows to happen or what God actively does in this life can only be judged by a measure of eternity, not the measure of this life. The people that died in Job's life, they were going to die at some point anyway. And that doesn't soften the blow, doesn't make it easier, but it helps us understand that God plays on a different time scale than we do. And that when we pass from this earth and we go into the next life, we are on a different time scale than we are here. We have to keep our eye on eternity. We can only say that God either did right or wrong, that we feel like we're caught in the middle of this eternal picture if we understand the eternal mindset. And that we trust God completely because of who He is. Like Abraham said in Genesis 18:25, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Because that's who He is. That's the God that we serve. We may not understand His time frame, but the judge of all the earth will do what is just, no matter what. And how does Job respond after this tragedy? Job 1:20-22, it says this. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Job mourns. And in mourning, Job worships. He falls before his God and he worships Him. Despite his feelings, despite his heartache, in the middle of devastation, Job worships his Creator. And when I think of this, I always think of the scene in How the Grinch Stole Christmas. After the Grinch has come through and he's taken everything out of Whoville and he's there on Christmas morning and all the Who's wake up and he's expecting them to all be sad and to cry and to throw a huge fit. But what happens? The Who's all come out and they all start to sing. They all start to celebrate Christmas even though nothing is there. So this reminds me of that even in tragedy, even when everything goes wrong, even when everything falls apart, we still can worship our God. We can sing joyfully. This is what Job does. Now imagine how foolish Satan must have felt in this moment. Because he wanted Job to curse God. He wanted Job to lash out, to be angry. And instead he hears his ears filled with worship of God. Imagine how foolish he felt. Imagine how angry he probably became. And this battle will go on. For about 38 more chapters, this battle is waged in the life of Job. And there's more devastation, there's more heartache to come. But when the first shots were fired, Job's first move was to worship God. That tells us a lot about who he is and a lot about what he's about. His first action was to fall to his knees and to worship his God. We can mourn, and we can mourn in worship because Job has his eye on eternity. That's the eye that we need to have when it comes to the things that are going on in this life. Job can respond with wisdom and with patience and with love. He can respond with the Lord gave and the Lord takes away because he has his eye on eternity. Everything Job had, he believed and knew, was a blessing from God. Everything. And therefore, for it to be taken away was no slight to him. It was God simply removing the blessings that he had so graciously poured out on Job to begin with. Nothing he had was solely his because he had earned it. Everything he had was because God chose for him to have it. And we should never think that the good things in our life that may be taken away, we should never think that the good things in this life that we have come from the world or come from our own work or from the earth. They come from heaven. They come from God to us as gifts. Undeserved, grace-filled graciousness into our life. God gives His gifts with kindness and thoughtfulness to each one of us. And when the Lord gives, the Lord can take away. And if we have that understanding, that it makes it easier for us not to deal with what happened, but to go to God and worship when it does. When devastation reigns, when tragedy strikes, we can trust in God. Job proclaims, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Satan wanted curses. Job utters blessings. The name of the Lord. Satan wanted to drive Job to hatred, but Job only loved more. And the more this life tries to pull you away from God, the closer to your Creator you should move. The more Satan tries to tear you away and tear you down, the closer to your God you should move. Satan says you should curse God. The world says you should curse God, but we should worship Him more. That's what we should be about. So let it be with us. If the devil tries to drive you down, if the devil tries to drive you to curse God, let us bless Him all the more. And eventually Satan will stop tempting you when he finds that the more he tempts you, the closer to God you grow. That's what he does. The Satan is the accuser of the brethren. He comes before God and he says, this person is only blessed because you've protected them. This person is only doing what they do out of gain for their own life. That's the only reason they're acting the way they are. Let me mess with them. Let me take away. Because if I do, they will curse your name. And if we don't curse His name, what happens? He's going to leave us alone. Because the closer we grow to God, the more frustrated and angry He's going to become. And there's easier targets out there. There's easier pickings for Him. We grow closer to God every single time He attacks us. He is disgusted because of His own darkness. And the closer you are driven to the light, the more and more painful it is for Him. He hates everything about you, and He will come to destroy you. But what Job teaches us is this: That while the spiritual warfare takes place, we take comfort because we don't fight this battle alone. We don't fight it alone. For us, Ephesians 6:13 says, "Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand the devil, withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm." We have the ability to see that and to read that and to understand that. Job didn't have that. But what you're going to see if you read through Job this week is that even though God is silent to Job, we're going to see Job go through things and Job lift his head up in moments that no human being should be able to do on their own. And what's going to be happening in those moments is the Spirit of God is going to be filling Job so that he can continue on. Job makes his stand. And so can we. We can stand against fear and not give in to panic, because there are moments in your life that are going to try to drive you to fear. And it's okay to be afraid, but what it's not okay to do is to panic in those moments and to not trust that God is there with us. We make our stand against fear by not giving in to panic. We make our stand against make-believe pretending that everything is okay. And we do that a lot in our lives. No, I'm okay. Hey, how are you doing? I'm doing okay. That's a lie most of the time. If somebody says they're okay, that's just they don't want to share what's actually going on in their life. Job makes a stand against that. He doesn't have to hide what's happening to him. He doesn't have to deny what's happening to him. He feels it. He knows what's happening. And he appropriately mourns what happens. That's okay. We can make our stand against these lies that everything is supposed to be smooth and okay all the time by mourning when it's appropriate. We make our stand against pride and we humble ourselves before God the same way Job did. Job didn't allow the blessings that he'd been given to become prideful in his life. When they were taken away, he didn't anger for them. He humbled himself before God the same way we can do. We make our stand against self. When we decide to worship God, we don't allow the things, again, that God blessed us with to drive us to pride. No, we allow it to drive us to worshiping our God. We make our stand against a mindset that says that this life is all that matters. A mindset that says that you got to get what you can get now because once you're gone, it's all gone. We make our stand against that mindset when we choose to think in terms of eternity. We make our stand against unbelief. We don't give in to vain questionings of God. We mourn when it's appropriate. We question when it's appropriate. But we trust that God knows what He's doing the same way Job did. We don't give in to despair. We don't give in to devastation when we look around and we see the blessings that are being removed, just like Job does. We don't give in to despair, but we see the hand of God at work even in that moments. When what we love is taken away, we don't despair. We trust that God knows what He is doing, even through catastrophe, even through brokenness. We make our stand against anger when we don't blame God, but we trust Him. And when we make these stands, when we fight these battles, we don't fight alone. You are never alone in this world. You are never alone in this life. Throughout the story of Job, you're going to see moments where any man on his own should crumble into dust and crawl into the earth and die, crawl under a rock and curse God. But he never does that. And he doesn't do that because of his own strength, because his own strength is completely gone at this point. He does this because he's not fighting these battles alone. Because the Spirit of God is there, lifting his eyes and lifting his head and lifting his hands and lifting his voice when it needs to. So that Job can continue to bless and honor God. And when I think of the story of Job, and I see the struggles in my life and the lives of others, I see a God who shows up in the darkest of times, the darkest of moments. That's what I see. I see a God who carries us through the storm and carries us through the hurt. But when we get to the end of our rope, a God who shows up and saves us. Just like He did with our sin, just like He did on the cross. When we get to the end of what we could possibly do on our own, God is there to pick us up and move us on. We find ourselves at the end of our rope, at the end our strength, when we finally come to a place where we can not go on by ourselves, guess who's there with us? It's our God. That's the story of Job. That's the story of what's happening here. Now close your eyes for just a moment. I want you to imagine something. If you've ever been to the ocean, if you've ever been to the beach, if you've ever been out in the water, or even at the lake or wherever. But when you go out there, and you find yourself too far from shore. Maybe this has happened to you, maybe it hasn't. And it feels like wave after wave after wave is pounding over top of you. And all you can hear is the chaos of the storm and the chaos of the ocean. With every wave that crashes over you, you're pulled further and further and further away from shore, and you struggle and you struggle and you struggle, and you get to the end of your strength. In that moment, you feel the hands of God lifting you out of that. That's the story of Job. That's the story of our life. When our struggles come, when our hurts come, when devastation comes, when destruction comes, when catastrophe comes, and we cannot fight this battle any longer on our own. At that moment, when we're ready to give up, when we're ready to trust wholly in God because we have nothing else to trust in, is when God holds us in His hand. And He lifts us up out of that storm. He lifts us up out of that struggle and out of that chaos. That's what happens in the life of Job. And if we'll trust Him, that's what happens in our life as well. Many times we are blessed beyond reason in our country. And that can make it difficult for us when struggle comes. But we can take examples from the life of Job and the lives of those around us. That in our darkest moments, God's light shines brightest. In our weakest moments, God's strength raises us up. And God does for us what we could never do for ourselves. That's the story of the gospel. God doing what we could not do for ourselves. We cannot forgive our own sins. We cannot pay for them. We can never do enough to make up for it. But God picked us up where we were and saved us. We are never promised in this life that it's going to be easy. We are never promised that you're going to be blessed. We're never promised any of that in this life. But when we keep our eye on eternity, we are. That one day when we pass from this life into the next, and we stand before our Creator, we worship Him for who He is and for what He's done. And we no longer struggle, we no longer hurt, we no longer suffer. If we keep our mind on that, then anything that happens here is a piece of cake. We mourn when we should, but we don't curse God. When we struggle, we don't give in to it. We don't give in to despair, but we trust God. In all that we do, we trust God because He saved us, not for this life, but for the next, because that's who He is. Now again, there's a lot in Job. If you read it this week, you'll see that there's a lot more that comes his way. But through all of that, Job always goes back to the first thing that he did, which was to worship his God, to trust fully in his Creator. That no matter what happens in our life, He's there for us. We don't walk this path alone. We don't fight these battles alone because that's who He is. That's what He does for us. Let's go ahead and pray.